everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at, it's a case from the Philippine Supreme Court. And it really got me thinking about workers' rights when I was reading it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one for sure.
Yeah. So the case kind of boils down to this question. Can a company, reassign employees to different jobs?
Yeah.
And maybe even less desirable ones to prevent what they call sabotage?
Right.
And if so,
Yeah.
where's the line? Like, where do we draw the line between, a legitimate business decision and what's considered constructive dismissal?
Exactly. And that's the crux of this case, really.
Yeah. And the case we're looking at today, oh man, it went through some crazy twists and turns. So first of all, the labor arbiter dismissed the initial complaints, and then the NLRC, that's the National Labor Relations Commission in the Philippines, they actually changed their mind 3 times.
Yeah, it was a real back and forth.
It's crazy. So yeah, we're going in for some twists and turns today.
Absolutely. What makes this case so interesting, I think, is it started out as a pretty common labor dispute, but then it ended up, becoming this landmark decision. And this decision really clarified the concept of constructive dismissal in the Philippines.
Right. So let's set the scene here. We've got 3 bakers, Arnaiz, Nepal, and Dolores. They worked for this guy named Edgar Reyes, who owned a few Julie's Bakeshop franchises.
Okay.
And these bakers, they had some complaints, some pretty serious complaints, the kind we hear about all too often, unfortunately.
Right.
So they claimed that they were being underpaid, that they weren't receiving benefits like holiday pay and 13th month pay. Basically, they were feeling like their basic rights as employees were being ignored.
Yeah. And it's important to note here that these complaints, these weren't about like minor inconveniences. We're talking about fundamental rights here, rights that many workers rely on.
Right.
And, when those rights are violated, it can have a significant impact on their lives and their livelihoods.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the bakers, they felt like they weren't being heard. So they decided to file formal complaints.
Yeah.
And that's when things took a turn. Okay. So Reyes, he responds by reassigning them from their baking duties to become utility and security personnel. So basically, they were moved from, working inside the bake shop, like crafting these delicious pastries, to cleaning the outside of the building.
Yeah.
And doing security checks.
Wow. So you're telling me that these skilled bakers, people who, probably take a lot of pride in their craft, are suddenly told to trade in their aprons for mops and security uniforms. That's a pretty drastic shift.
Oh, yeah.
I can definitely understand why the bakers saw this as a demotion, even if their pay technically stayed the same.
Yeah. It's like asking a concert pianist to just suddenly become the stagehand.
Right.
So naturally. The bakers, they refused these new roles. They felt like their skills were being totally disregarded, and that this reassignment was a direct response to their complaints, like they were being punished for speaking up.
Yeah, that's classic retaliation. And this is where the whole idea of constructive dismissal comes into play. It's a bit of a legal puzzle, but essentially it means that even if an employer doesn't directly fire you, they can create a work environment that's so hostile or unbearable that you're basically forced to quit. And that's what the bakers were arguing here.
Right. So they felt like they were being pushed out the back door instead of being shown the front door.
Right.
But the end result was the same. They were losing their jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In this case, it really tests the limits of what an employer can do when it comes to, reassigning employees. On the one hand, businesses do need to be able to adapt and make changes. Sometimes that involves, moving people into different roles.
Right.
But on the other hand, employees have the right to be treated fairly. They shouldn't be subjected to retaliation just for asserting their rights.
So it's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly.
So how did this all play out? I mean, were the bakers able to prove that this reassignment was actually retaliation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll get into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready for more.
Get ready for some legal back and forth.
Yeah.
And a decision that really set a precedent for workers' rights in the Philippines.
All right, I can't wait. So the bakers are feeling pretty cornered, right? They think this whole reassignment thing is just because they filed complaints, like a way to punish them for speaking up.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Did anyone, side with the bakers? Did they find any support?
Well, at first, it really didn't seem like the legal system was on their side. The labor arbiter, the first one to hear this case, actually ruled in favor of the employer, Edgar Reyes.
Oh, wow. Really? So the labor arbiter thought it was okay for Reyes to just, move the bakers to these totally different jobs. What was the logic there?
Yeah, it's a little strange. It seems like the arbiter mainly focused on technicalities with the paperwork that the bakers had submitted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it just goes to show that even when you have a legitimate grievance, trying to navigate the legal system, it can be really tricky. Sometimes even like small procedural errors can totally change the outcome of a case.
Yeah, that's a good point. It sounds super frustrating for the bakers, though. Like they already felt ignored and now they're running into these roadblocks. Did they just give up at that point?
No, they were pretty determined. They decided to appeal the decision to the National Labor Relations Commission, the NLRC, hoping for, a better outcome. And this is where the case gets really interesting. It took a turn that honestly surprised even me. And I've been following labor law cases for years.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What happened at the NLRC? Did they finally side with the bakers?
Well, it wasn't that simple. The NLRC's decision went back and forth so many times, like a ping pong ball, honestly.
By vote.
So first they agreed with the labor arbiter, they sided with Reyes.
Yeah.
But then, get this, they actually reconsidered the case and reversed their decision. Yeah, they stated that the bakers were actually constructively dismissed. They recognized that the reassignment was a major demotion. And most likely, done in retaliation for the complaints, it seemed like the bakers had finally caught a break.
It sounds like the NLRC, finally understood what the bakers were going through. Yeah. And that their rights were violated. So case closed, right?
Uh-huh. I wish. But no, the NLRC, in a move that I still don't quite understand, decided to reverse their decision again.
Are you serious?
Yeah. This time they said that the bakers had abandoned their jobs, basically siding with Reyes again. It was a total shock. I think everyone was wondering what was going on at that point.
Wow, that is a roller coaster of decisions. I'm starting to see why you said this case had so many twists and turns. It must have been so confusing and frustrating for the bakers.
Yeah.
Like 1 minute they're winning and then the next they're back to square one. Did this go on forever?
Thankfully, no. The bakers, they were determined to fight for their rights. So they appealed this latest NLRC decision to the Court of Appeals. And this is where things finally start to change. This is where the case becomes really important for workers' rights in the Philippines.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. What did the Court of Appeals decide?
The Court of Appeals, after looking at all the evidence and the arguments, ruled in favor of the bakers. They agreed that they were constructively dismissed and that the reassignment was a clear demotion. Even though their pay technically stayed the same, their reasoning here was super important.
Okay, so what was it about the Court of Appeals decision that made it so significant? Why did this become such a landmark case?
Well, for one, they really addressed the issue of an employer's right to reassign employees. They said that, yeah, of course companies need some flexibility, to manage their workforce and make changes. But any reassignment has to be done in good faith. It can't be used to retaliate against employees who are exercising their rights.
All right, that makes sense. It can't just be a free-for-all where employers move people around whenever they feel like it, especially if it's just to punish someone for speaking out.
Exactly.
So what else did the Court of Appeals say?
Well, they looked really closely at the specific facts of the case. They pointed out that Reyes, the employer, he claimed that he reassigned the bakers to protect his business from sabotage.
Okay.
But they couldn't find any real evidence to support that claim. In fact, they highlighted that one of the bakers, Dolores, he was actually kept in his position even after Reyes had accused him of sabotage.
Yeah, that does seem kind of suspicious.
Yeah.
If Reyes really thought Dolores was such a threat to the business, why not reassign him too?
Yeah.
It seems like the court saw through that excuse.
Right. It doesn't really add up. So basically, the Court of Appeals didn't just call out the employer's questionable motives. They went further and ordered specific remedies to make things right for the bakers.
Okay, so they didn't just say, go back to your old jobs.
Nope. They ordered full reinstatement to their original positions. So the bakers got their seniority back, their benefits. Everything was as if they'd never been reassigned in the first place.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
They were basically saying that Reyes couldn't just mess with these bakers' lives and careers without facing any real consequences. So did they do anything else to make up for what the bakers went through?
Oh, yeah. They didn't stop at reinstatement. The court also ordered back pay for the bakers, so Reyes had to pay them for all the time they were stuck in those other jobs, plus any benefits they missed out on, like holiday pay or bonuses.
Okay.
And to really send a message, they also awarded attorney fees to the bakers, meaning Reyes had to pay for their legal expenses too.
Yeah.
It was a total victory for the bakers, and a clear signal to employers that you can't just violate workers' rights without consequences.
Yeah, that's a big win for the bakers. So we've seen this case go from what seemed like a pretty straightforward labor dispute to this whole legal battle, with decisions going back and forth. And finally, the Court of Appeals comes in and makes this really clear ruling in favor of the bakers. They even get back pay and legal fees. It definitely sounds like this case set a new standard for workers' rights in the Philippines. But what about the bigger picture? What does this mean for other workers and employers who might end up in a similar situation?
That's the question we'll tackle in the last part of our deep dive. This case isn't just about three bakers in the Philippines. It brings up some really important questions about the power dynamics in the workplace. The importance of due process and what it really means to protect workers' rights.
So we've seen how this case went from, a complaint about bakery conditions to this like landmark legal decision. And it really does seem like a win for workers' rights. I mean, but did this really actually change anything, like for other workers and employers in the Philippines?
Oh, it definitely had a lasting impact. It wasn't just about, resolving this one dispute between these bakers and their boss. It set a precedent. And that precedent clarified the whole concept of constructive dismissal. And it really forced companies to rethink how they approach employee reassignments.
Right. So suddenly it wasn't enough to just be like, okay, you're moving to a different department or whatever.
Exactly. Employers had to prove that those changes were made for legitimate reasons.
Right.
And not as some kind of retaliation or punishment.
So it wasn't just a win for the bakers. It actually changed things.
Yeah, definitely. What I saw happening was that a lot of companies, they started reviewing their policies. The ones about reassignments. They had to make sure everything was transparent and fair.
Makes sense.
They couldn't just, move people around for no reason. They needed to have, documented reasons and follow a clear process.
Right. It's like we were saying before, companies need flexibility, but not at the expense of their employees. So did this case, empower workers to speak up more? Did they feel more confident about pushing back against unfair treatment?
I think so, for sure. This case became like a rallying cry for labor rights. It showed that workers could actually fight for their rights and win, even when it seemed like the system was against them.
Wow.
I think it gave employees more courage to speak up about unfair treatment because they knew that they had legal options, if they faced retaliation.
So it shifted the balance of power a bit.
Yeah, I think so, even if it was just a little bit. It gave workers more leverage to hold their employers accountable.
And it shows how important it is to have clear laws that protect those rights.
Absolutely. Having a clear legal framework creates a more level playing field.
Right.
It prevents one side from taking advantage of the other.
But let's be real. Even with these laws in place, some employers are going to try to find ways around them. What can workers do to protect themselves?
Well, first of all, knowledge is power. The more you understand your rights, the better you'll be at recognizing when those rights are being violated.
Right.
And don't be afraid to ask questions or to seek clarification. If something doesn't seem right, speak up.
Yeah, don't stay silent.
And document everything.
Okay.
Emails, conversations, anything that supports your claim.
Good advice.
And if you need to consult with a labor rights attorney, explore your options.
It's all about being informed and taking action.
Exactly.
Don't wait until it's too late.
Right. This case is a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a fairer work environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a conversation that we need to keep having. How do we balance the needs of workers with the needs of businesses?
Yeah. How do we make sure everyone is treated fairly and with respect?
Exactly. These are big questions that we need to keep thinking about.
Wow. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with a small bakery in the Philippines, and we ended up talking about these huge issues that affect workers everywhere.
It's amazing how these small disputes can sometimes lead to major changes.
Right. And it shows that each of us has the power to make a difference. So what's your final takeaway? What do you want our listeners to remember from this conversation?
I hope our listeners will think about their own experiences at work and really understand the importance of knowing their rights and advocating for themselves.
Yeah.
Fairness and respect. They're not just ideas. They should be part of every workplace. And when those principles are violated, there are ways to fight back.
That's a great point.
We can demand better.
Yeah, we can. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been fascinating.
It has been.
And to our listeners, keep learning,
Oh,
keep asking questions,
yeah.
and keep fighting for a fairer world of work. Until next time.